What we'll do next is look at the religious wars that plagued, especially Western Europe at this time. Now, I'm going to give a lot of sort of detail here to describe how these wars unfolded. The point is not that you remember all the detail. Rather, what I'd like you to do is get a feel for how, especially Reformed Protestants, might have experienced what was at stake in these wars. Now, two things to keep in mind. First of all through this time, the Ottoman threat still loomed. In 1571, the Catholic nations of southern Europe had inflicted a major defeat on the Turks in the naval battle of Lepanto, which stopped Turkish expansion in the Mediterranean, but the threat remained present constantly in the minds of Europeans. Second thing to keep in mind is that it's very easy when you're reading an account like Gonzalez's to just get lost in all the details and come to the conclusion that the struggles of the Reformation were merely political or opportunistic. And that's why I want to spend some time talking about them, because that's not how Reformed Christians experienced it. For them, this time was a struggle to establish churches that preached and practiced the true gospel, as opposed to what they viewed as the false gospel, which was not a true church at all, the Roman Catholic Church, and then to maintain those true churches amid brutal persecution. And for Reformed or Protestant Christians who had political power, it was considered a matter of duty to protect the true church and its people from the violence of tyrannical rulers. Now, they could have simply become Anabaptists and withdrawn from the whole political situation, but they believed God called Christians to be involved in politics and to make a difference and to try to reform societies. They were willing to struggle, many of these people, and die if necessary to do so. So we need to keep that in mind. Some of these rulers, it's, they're willing to put their life on the line. They take their piety and their faith so seriously that they take grave risks to do so. Now, it's true that leaders often did what was pragmatic rather than always principled. It's true that that war led to atrocities and assassinations, and that all manner of grievous things were done by both sides. But that doesn't mean that who won and who was in power was simply political, or that we should be cynical about it. Not only was freedom of worship at stake, but thousands of lives were at stake, and they certainly believed thousands of souls were at stake. The wars of religion began in France. In 1560, the French king Charles IX was only 10 years old. His mother, Catherine de' Medici, was regent, and two great noble families, the House of Guise, which was Catholic, and the House of Bourbon, which was Protestant, were competing for influence in the regency. Catherine wanted unity, as did her leading clergyman, Cardinal Lorraine. So in 1561, they brought Reformed and Catholic clergy together for a conference. Calvin was still alive, but he sent his protege, Theodore Beza, to attend this conference on his behalf. This is Beza. But the conference failed. It's another one of those examples of what might have been. Still, Catherine didn't want war, so she issued an edict granting Protestants toleration in France. But the Catholic House of Guise rejected this, and in 1562 its soldiers slaughtered dozens of Protestants who were secretly worshiping in a barn. And this was what sparked the First French War of Religion. Geneva, including Calvin and Beza, supported the Protestant or Huguenot cause, as did many French synods. Calvin did so because he believed that the princes of the House of Bourbon, who were of royal blood and therefore known as princes of the blood, were lesser magistrates who had not only the right but the obligation to resist injustice on the part of the crown. The war did not go well for the Huguenots, but when peace was negotiated, they were granted freedom of worship, and they were even granted control of certain parts of the country. But war would break out again repeatedly in the coming years. The situation was more dire in the Netherlands. There, the Spanish Inquisition's persecution of Protestants, whether Reformed, Lutheran, or Anabaptist, was so intense that even Catholic nobility were growing tired of it. After all, this was the land of Erasmus, the great humanist, who had called magistrates to care for the souls of their subjects. And the persecution was undermining trade and prosperity. So in 1566, the nobility, Catholic and Protestant alike, pressured the local ruler, Margaret of Parma, who ruled on behalf of Spain, to grant toleration. This led to a wave of public preaching in the Netherlands, followed by a campaign of iconoclasm that surpassed anything Europe had ever seen. Towns, on their own initiative, began establishing reformed churches governed by consistories. A crackdown was inevitable. Spanish troops arrived in 1567 and began conquering the southern region of the Netherlands, which is modern-day Belgium, where the Reformation was strongest. Among those who were killed was Guido de Brès, author of the Belgic Confession. Many Protestants fled to Germany, but others remained behind, gathering secretly and working out their theology of resistance against tyranny. Then the Duke of Alva arrived from Spain with 10,000 Spanish troops. He hauled thousands of people before a council of troubles and executed over 1,000 of them. He imposed new regulations defying the rights of the local nobility, to the point that William of Orange, who would become the hero of the Dutch struggle and is the subject of the Dutch national anthem today, raised forces to drive the Duke of Alva out. But William of Orange was repeatedly defeated, and the Dutch had to look to the German princes and to England and to the French Huguenots for help. Now again, keep in mind that in the minds of the Dutch people here, they're simply fighting for religious liberty and for liberty from the Spanish. In 1572, Dutch sailors known as sea beggars began liberating towns along the coast. And then they began liberating much of the northern Netherlands, which is modern-day Netherlands proper. They kept the cause alive, and they captured the imagination of the country. The Protestant leader, William of Orange, actually called for the toleration of Catholics in order to unite the country. And this is a first step in the Netherlands actually becoming the first country in Western Europe to consistently move in the direction of religious toleration. And they did it in order to try to find some form of unity against the Spanish. This call for toleration was sporadically honored, but it was often ignored in times of violence. Meanwhile, the Spanish Duke of Alva launched a furious counteroffensive, and he was notorious for his brutality. The Spanish would slaughter entire towns of people to try to get control of the country. The watershed moment for Protestant-Catholic relations in Western Europe as a whole came in France in 1572. At first, it seemed that that year might be a breakthrough year. Huguenot leaders gathered in Paris for the wedding of the king's sister to a leading reformed prince, Henry of Navarre. Theodore Beza, Calvin's successor in Geneva, considered Henry of Navarre the great hope of the Reformation, and he was in constant contact with him. And a lot of people hoped that the marriage would lead way to a Protestant Catholic settlement in France. This is Henry of Navarre. But King Charles was convinced of a Protestant plot against him, and he ordered the killing of Huguenot leaders in Paris. It's still debated exactly what he had in mind and how it related to what happened, but the result was the brutal St. Bartholomew's Day massacre that spread throughout France to the point where at least 5,000 Protestants were murdered, and many more were forced to convert to Catholicism, including Henri, a prisoner in Paris. many churches ceased to exist. And to horrified Protestants, it became a symbol of Catholic treachery. In 1574, Henri III became king. This is not Henri of Navarre, this is a different Henri. Like many moderate Catholics, he wanted the realm to be united, which required toleration. By this time, much of southern France was an autonomous Huguenot area, and in 1576, King Henri III sponsored an agreement to try to ratify this state of affairs, make it permanent in hopes of peace. In other words, permanently allow Protestants to control their lands in southern France. But as before, militant Catholics, now associated with the Jesuits increasingly, refused to accept this. And the Catholic House of Guise organized a league, and with the help of the Estates General, which is sort of like a French parliamentary type body, they forced the king to go to war against the Protestants. So France was now going back to war, and by now the Netherlands was divided in two as well, with an occupied southern part submitting to Philip's rule and the northern part fighting on against him. In 1581, the free part of the Netherlands deposed Philip of Spain and began looking for a new king. 3 years later, in yet another infamous moment of treachery, William of Orange, who by this point had become reformed, was assassinated by a French Catholic. And that same year, Spain, who's fighting against the Netherlands, made a deal with the House of Guise, the Catholic house in France, to intervene in France as well, and deny the Protestant Henri of Navarre the throne. The Pope was part of it, and he excommunicated Henri of Navarre the following year. So the wars expanded. This map, by the way, gives you a sense of the areas that were, the purple areas were the areas controlled by the League. That was the Catholic Alliance in France. The orange areas were the areas controlled by Henri of Navarre around 1585, and the green areas would have been contested or controlled by neither side. But it gives you a sense of just how closely divided France was. And all this time, Elizabeth, of course, is just up here across the channel. War is raging here in the Netherlands. War is raging throughout France. And many Protestants are hoping that Elizabeth up here might intervene. She was reluctant to get involved until the Pope in 1570 excommunicated Elizabeth and forbade her subjects to obey her government. This made Catholics the automatic enemies of Elizabeth and of the English government. For the rest of her reign, she faced the threat of plots and assassination, just like the assassinations that were plaguing Protestants in France and the Netherlands. And so finally, under pressure from her Protestant advisors and subjects, she decided to intervene on behalf of the Dutch Protestants fighting against Spain. And so you can see how really this is becoming a whole Western Europe-wide war. Philip II in Spain decided that this was a good time to take out England and conquer it for Catholicism once and for all. At this point, Spanish was the world's great power. It had the great colonial empire in America, and it had the world's greatest fleet, the Spanish Armada. And Philip assembled that Armada, the most powerful fleet in the world, and convinced that he had a mission from God, he sent it to conquer England for the true church. The English, however, viewed their nation as God's special instrument because England was the world's greatest Protestant power. They knew that if Spain conquered England, it would bring all the horrors of the Spanish Inquisition that had already been haunting Spain for a century and been haunting the Netherlands for decades. They saw Elizabeth. Remember, they're reading Fox's Book of Martyrs. They're thinking about what God's doing through Elizabeth, and they saw her as being raised by God to defend Christ's kingdom in England, and possibly beyond England. This conviction was enhanced when, by a seeming miracle, a timely storm being involved, a tiny inferior English fleet amazingly managed to defeat the powerful Spanish Armada. This was considered a David and Goliath moment, Spain being the superpower, England being much weaker. 1588, the year of the defeat of the Spanish Armada, was sealed in English minds as the moment of God's deliverance of England. It was celebrated by Protestants everywhere. It was seen as proof of God's favor. And for the first time, English Protestants began to see their country as a serious rival to Spanish power. In fact, it was at this time that the English were beginning to explore and to launch colonial enterprises toward America. And a major part of their motivation was to rival the Spanish influence in America. As they saw it, unlike Spain, who was notorious for the black legend that had led them to be so ruthless toward Native Americans, unlike Spain, England would treat the Indians justly. And unlike Spain, who was converting them to Catholic Christianity, which Protestants considered false, they intended to bring the Indians to true Christianity. And they believed the Indians would welcome them as a much better alternative to the Spanish and embrace Christianity with open arms. Back in France, meanwhile, the moderate Catholic king, Henri III, was so frustrated with the militancy of the Catholic Duke of Guise, leader of the Catholic League, that he had him murdered. The League cried for revenge, and in 1589 a lay Dominican assassinated the Catholic King of France. From his deathbed, as he was dying, he urged support for Henri of Navarre, the Protestant, because Henri of Navarre, a Protestant, was now the heir to the French throne. So here, it's a good moment to pause and sort of think here. You've got your Protestants on one hand, you've got your extreme Catholics associated with the League on the other hand, and in the middle you have moderate Catholics like Henri III, who says, hey, I know a Protestant is now inheriting the French throne, Henri IV, formerly Henri of Navarre, but for the sake of unity and peace, I want you to submit to him. This angered militant Catholics so much that they eulogized the Dominican who had assassinated the Catholic king. It was Henri IV, then, the Protestant, who defeated Spain and ended France's religious wars. He defeated the League, and remember that the Spanish had intervened on the side of the Catholic League. Henri IV battled against the League for 9 years, but the League kept fighting. So finally, the Protestant Henri IV decided that peace and unity demanded his conversion to Catholicism. He decided that militant Catholics would never allow a Protestant king of France. So he became a Catholic, and he was pardoned by the Pope. Now this horrified many Protestants, including Beza, Calvin's follower in Geneva. But in the end, Beza decided that Henri was actually doing something a lot like Samson in the Old Testament. He was sacrificing himself for the good of God's people, because although he would be Catholic, he was certain to be friendly to Protestants and could bring them peace in France. In 1598, Spain, still reeling from the defeat of the Armada, signed a treaty ending this last French war of religion. And, true to Beza's hopes, Henri IV, formerly Protestant, now Catholic, issued the Edict of Nantes, granting Huguenots toleration in most of the country and control in their fortified cities, and thus ending 36 years of the French wars of religion, in which as many as 3 million people had died. And this shows the cities and regions, the square cities and the orange regions. I know the map's in French, I apologize for that, but those are the regions that were given toleration for Huguenots to worship. By now, the Catholic cause was on its heels in the Netherlands too. Spain was on the defensive. The Netherlands declared itself a republic in 1590, and amazingly, the Netherlands was beginning to emerge from the war as a significant trade and naval power with a booming economy. It was considered an economic miracle that in the midst of war, this could happen. In 1609, the Dutch Republic established a formal 12-year truce with Spain, and thus began the golden age of the Netherlands. But it's interesting to note that although the Netherlands was fighting on the Reformed side and therefore emerged as a Reformed power, there were also many Catholics who had supported the Dutch war for liberation. And so even afterward, the Dutch Republic maintained a surprising degree of religious toleration. It was unprecedented in Western Europe. Nowhere else in Western Europe did so many people have toleration as in the Netherlands. But now it had to decide how to establish a Reformed church, how to apply Calvinist church principles on a national scale, when only a minority of the Dutch people were actually committed Calvinists. So they gradually worked out a compromise. They decided that only people who made a profession of faith could take the Lord's Supper, and those people would be subject to church discipline. But no laws could require that membership, and the rest of the population would be baptized, but not able to take the Lord's Supper, and therefore not subject to discipline. At the same time, it was decided that the state would pay pastors' salaries, and pastors would baptize, marry, or perform other services for anyone who requested them. By 1600, perhaps 50% of the Dutch population were members or regular attenders of Reformed churches, but there were still very sizable minorities of Catholics and Anabaptists. So by this point, things settle a little bit. The wars of religion come to an end. The Netherlands emerges as a reformed country. England is a reformed-ish country with the Church of England. And Huguenots have toleration and significant influence in many parts of France. Again, we could look back at these religious wars and think, oh, it was all just political. And certainly there was politics involved and terrible violence and atrocities on both sides. But at the same time, it's easy for us to look back and say that it was not right for them to fight for their the protection of their areas or their liberty. But you have to put yourself in the position of the nobility and the lesser magistrates and kings and princes in these areas. And for them, it was God obligated them to protect the people under them. And that sometimes meant fighting just wars on their behalf. So that's where I'll leave us, and hopefully we can continue to discuss these things in the chat.